Monday, July 11th, 8:40 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. Meditation Journal. Thoughts interrupting my ability to meditate as of late. Having to do directly with the core spiritual challenge that is meditation, which is to sit and judge and evaluate and be attached to none of it and observe. For me, at one level, this problematic self-observation gets caught up in an argument with itself about whether or not all of this is nonsense, a waste of time, and when is one, myself, meant to actually make the art that I'm supposed to make, that I'm seeking inspiration for in the meditation. And is that an attachment that's ruining the meditation? The twisty, tumbling turnings of the mind in that sort of derailing jumble of thoughts that distracts you from the inner activity of being still and silent within the confines of your own internal mental experience. The phenomenological mental terrain landscape of especially that which is beyond words, but the gap from which the words come from, the words that rattle around in your mind, whether it's an ideation of some self-narrative description of your recent past, your long ago past, your potential future, your aspirations for lifelong dreams, etc. The entire scope, from its most busy and self-tormenting and its most Zen-like, profoundly still, it's all a phenomena that we quite literally still can't quite explain or wrap our own minds around to find an explanation that makes sense. And it's not just a interesting reality factoid about the science and lack thereof about it, but rather an inner horrifying admission that is so horrific, so frightening, so alarming, that, even those of us who dare contemplate it don't want to contemplate it very much, because there is no knowable answer to it. But what is this thing that's going on? We don't really know the answer to what life is, what this ambulatory meat sack of blood and bone and fatty tissue is actually doing, and how it is actually doing it. And curiously, life itself, the experiencing of it, if you're really, really honest with yourself, gives you a full, broad spectrum range of personal, tangible experience that kind of runs the gambit between the transcendent and sublime to the most, obtuse of the mundane. And I don't say that to say one is better than the other, but rather that it's almost as if it were literally true that here on this place, in these bodies, trapped in these mind, spirit ghosts things, driving these exoskeletons through the nervous system, that we call our pedantic life really is sort of both heaven and hell. This admission, because I don't even call it a question, but let's treat it as a question. Do you know the ultimate answer to life, the universe, and everything, and how the F you even function phenomenologically? Most human individuals are no more capable of describing why their bodies grow and heal and change over time, and how the cells within them can do it, further than their best comprehension at school. And that's to say that there's still a lot of mystery, and even the smartest of us don't really know what's going on. And when it comes to the deeper questions of, like, where do our thinky thoughts come from? Where do our impulses come from? Where does our measuring tape of reality actually function, and how? Like, what is it that we're doing? What's really going on? And of course, in postmodern times, there's all kinds of answers vying for everyone's attention, ranging from those that require leaps of blind faith to those that require, sticking your head in your own sandlot to not think too hard and just agree, nod, and regurgitate. But no one really knows is the bottom line. Like, I don't pretend to know. I think I've experienced things that I can attempt to describe, because that is perhaps something I'm being invited to do by the very thing that we are, which is an ongoing, multifaceted, yet somehow curiously not hive-minded, because we're not. We are very intensely individuated as a human species, but there's no denying that we are intrinsically, no matter how much you care not to think about it, how much you refuse to contemplate it as part of your day-to-day life, the human species is intrinsically interconnected and intra-related in many ways, some of which are at the level of mystery that we don't quite comprehend just yet. And one of the things that unites us is that none of us know how our brains work. How it is the mind conjures up the images that it conjures up and renders things that we didn't know we were going to render. No one can really answer to you what dreams are. Everybody's suggestions or statements or claims are personal and or group-think theories. Even the best of the science is only truly, if you're honest about what the statements being made and the assumptions being made and the lack of fullness in concrete, repeatable, we've figured something out and now we can verify it kind of level stuff that we just still don't have answers for. We really don't know, ultimately. Especially not when it comes to the inspired stuff, the art, the imagery, the hallucinations, the ideations that were unexpected and unpredictable, the visions, of gods and monsters, all of it. We really don't comprehend. And people are arguing about particular and or specific theories, and some take themselves so seriously as to believe to have achieved some undeniable achievement. But I argue that each of us, in our deepest, darkest corner of our minds, and our hearts, and our souls, because it is a trifecta one way or the other, will face that question some point and step up to the precipice of that frightening reality, which is we don't actually really know. Especially when we try to pick amongst all the varied, sensible-sounding and or wild and wacky and fantastical-sounding theories about said phenomena and what it means, especially once you get into the philosophy of the meaning of life. All kinds of interestingly articulated theories, but no one can concretely determine that they have absolutely fundamentally explained it all in a way that is undebunkable and so sound as to be accepted as, roundly as verified and proven fact. And very little truly is. In terms of the information that we know about the universe as we can perceive it, very little is actually over there in that bucket. Most of it is pretty solid theoretical descriptions that seem to consistently test positive in the measurable known world as we can engage with it, but also leaving lots of questions yet unanswered that we don't get to a fundamental explanation of everything all in one tidy package. the human mind remains, terra incognita, a very precipice itself, a horizon point, a liminal space, to borrow both from theater and from anthropomorphology, one of those anthropology type words that are a science that's a study of two other words smashed together that includes anthro and sociology and other things. A liminal phenomenological experience that we are all quite routinely, begrudgingly accustomed to and almost exhausted by. So familiar we are with it that we hold our own selves in contempt and, in disdain, and in near exhaustion of our own experience. Most human beings, at least, are flirtingly familiar with that level of self-taking for grantedness, I guess. And, in the course of any given individual's life, we've gotten to become jaded about the very raw phenomena of being alive itself, to the point where we no longer culturally value it as a great mystery more than we pay lip service to it, as if we still held some hope that an answer was just around the corner that would unlock some mystery that would solve all the problems that we face in the world. And thus we run the rat race that we've created to keep ourselves distracted from that very riddle, that very true riddle that phenomenologically we sit inside our own skulls, like the Danish prince gone rabid mad for not really understanding who and what we actually are. And we argue with ourselves as much as we argue with each other out there in the externalized, shared experience about what is and or is not the answer to all those questions. Like, what is reality? How does it work? What forms and functions are happening both in the mind and outside of the mind that render these sounds and images that we experience? Now, of course, there is a great deal which science has verifiably been able to assert through repeated, measurable, confirmable, data-driven exploration of the physical apparatus, and then some conjecture and sprinkle in some theoretical, proofs to go get to some next level understanding, and boom, a pretty decently complex understanding and mapping out of the fundamental physical world and how the physical phenomena that is the body avatar, the apparatus within which the mind and the soul and the heart and the sensory apparatuses that communicate to that which is the observer, all the different data that's being registered in and surrounding us and through us. For, as some have argued, the body avatar, the corpus humani, is not just a physical block of meat and cheese. It is a conduit, perhaps a transducer, arguably, an antenna system, a semi-ambulatory, semi-autonomous motion capture video camcorder antenna array that receives and transmits the holographic reproduction of sensory data input and extrapolated thought projections based on sensory data input of the physical phenomenological whirlwind of toroidal probabilistic experiential projection and manifestation cycles. Now, to some people, my statement may have begun in a very cohesive place and then, to their minds, gone sliding down a slippery slope of slowly becoming unintelligible gobbledygook. Perhaps. But I argue, I challenge you, especially in the proto-future of the probability waveform function in which I'm conjecturing to project this message, to go ahead and dig up an actual dictionary, maybe even, a printed one, should you happen to have one at your disposal, one that was printed before the internet existed. I double dog dare you, if you're going to get your hands on one of those, and look up all those words that I just rattled off and tell me that if after coming to a working definition, my statement didn't then render a little bit more, understandable that it might have at first glance, at first blush. To the best of my understanding, the human apparatus takes in sensory input and also generates and projects, like whatever you would call the inverse opposite of sensory input would be. You'd need a name for that I don't think we have coined yet. But the ancient mystics probably used certain language and or certain types of ideas to describe. And arguably, collectively, we either cascade into, towards a flowing river of creating reality around us together, consciously and or unconsciously, collectively, thoughtfully and or pure blind neglectfully, without realizing what we're doing, because that's just how it is. The mind is simultaneously reading the data that's on the disk and writing the data that goes on the disk, to borrow an analogy that could be considered like a matrix schematic type analogy. But there's a pin on the corkboard for those of you who are familiar with that storytelling device that is a long-standing trope here in the Zeppoverse. There's a pin on the corkboard for that already, and that's, everyone is using the word matrix wrong. And if you haven't heard that, stay tuned. I'm probably going to do a new special episode about that, just for shits and giggles, in the not-too-distant future. But I digress. The matrix being not what it is in the movie, but rather what the ancients, spiritual psychonauts of lore and mythology might have been pointing towards, with the sort of mother womb, as in, the living Gaian uterus that is like a web of weaving the material phenomena into existence out of the sheer void potentiality of whatever is on the other side of that liminal boundary of matter before it emanates out into existence. Quantum mechanical physics and the cutting-edge sciences that branched out from it and beyond in the post-modern era seem to be, in some of their explorations and theoretical discussions from a completely amateur's perspective, seem to be finding places of agreement, points along which one could preposterously argue, such as, I am not the only one in my lifetime that has made such suggestions, but that the cutting edge of all sciences has ever increasingly been sort of recursively reaching back to rediscover and, think it is discovering for the first time quite often, and rename in new and different creative ways that are sometimes slightly more intellectually useful in terms of, grasping a broader and deeper understanding of everything and how it works. And they still haven't quite gone full Monty with it, but there seems to be a recursive, not a circling full backwards in time, but a recursive spiraling back over previously treaded areas of phenomenological experience that correlate, and that, like, the mathematics is sort of proving what the poets and the mystics and the spiritualists and the wild people of the fringe of the world have sometimes said, that this dream, to call reality itself, the universe itself, a dream, is that of some great, grand, expansive, universal, godlike mind, which is indeed quite busy doing pretty much the same thing your mind is doing whenever it dreams into existence imagery, whether you concocted it willingly with the mental awareness of your conscious choice in doing so, the way we might do so in active imagination, or whether it, sprang forth unsolicited in what you might call passive imagination, or, daydreaming ideation, and or inspired insight of the muses upon the arts, the artists, etc., that all of those phenomena are correlative to each other in both the microcosm and the macrocosm. That the universe itself might very well be, both figuratively and literally, a giant mind of an infinity of minds, comprised of the very core witness, whatever that is, because there is a place at the bottom of the phenomena, at the central spiraling vortex of the whatever we are in the midst of this corporeal, multidimensional, individuated experience that you call me, that I call me, that, when we speak, in certain terms, we speak of in the terms of I am, that which is that which I am, right? And get sort of biblical about it, but it's also pre-biblical, that very notion. That core is a singularity that is common, singularly common, across all the possible phenomenological nodal points of individuated experience known as life. So the rabbit and the hawk eating it, the snail and the blade of grass it's crawling up, the beer and the person drinking it are all this witness of a whipping dream-like in some way that's yet not quite possible to explain in human languages without finding a way to connect spoken language with mathematics, with transcendentalist mathematics, which we haven't quite yet invented, and fractalism, and the sorts of things that are witnessed by the psychonauts are all integrated into one meta-science. We won't have a fully satisfactory description, right? And that requires more minds delving deep down into the only rabbit hole worth truly navigating down towards the very bottom of. Because I think this is also a pin on the corkboard. If it isn't, it shall become one now, officially. That didn't resonate as much as I wanted it to. But there are many false rabbit holes. If there's fake news, friends, there's fake rabbit hole systems of fake rabbit holes, of fake conspiracy theory and or fake spiritual, fake pseudo-religious, fake really religious, fake fakiness, because it's the oldest con in all of our own existence, distracting ourselves knowingly or unknowingly, wittingly or unwittingly, consciously or unconsciously, intentionally or unintentionally, distracting ourselves through a seduction of the ego into anything and everything other than an exploration of the healing of the ego, the reintegration of the ego, and the transcendence of the ego, which is the trifecta, which would unlock the human species into some new next level, gear shifting of evolutionary expression of self. Which may include such features as the following, but not limited to, magical abilities like telekinesis and the capacity to understand each other at a mind-to-mind level instead of at a ego, defensive, construct, argumentative, sentence-making, jabberwocky level. And that we have simply just been beating our heads against the same, made-up mountains and molehills that we created for ourselves and have just allowed to going on for millennia, to the point of probably traumatizing ourselves generationally for the last who knows how many multitudes of generations, in a treadmill of not allowing ourselves as a collective to evolve and be reimagined, as it were, by the very cosmic mind itself into some next level expression of what it means to be on this evolutionary path, which we may or may not have the fullest understanding of, even given all the great things and fascinating things we have discovered about it. Because if you think about it, this is all about genomics, right? Like, what is the genome? Poetically speaking, some would argue that's the true fingertip of God, crafting the very clay into life, right? Instead of being a literalist, and we took a spiritually pragmatic, poetic, licensist approach, if I can make up and coin a new interpretive approach to understanding any scripture, and that there's code and or poetry and or, besides whatever garbage nonsense may be that is corruption that has been added over the millennia, because it has been stripped and rebuilt like a car that's been sold over decade after decade, and disassembled for parts and cobbled back together again as a slightly different car. All the texts have, tragically, but the gems transcend. And the thing about the gems in terms of the true truths as opposed to the mostly fake truths, because there are like different kinds of shades of like true truths, and some of them are not so true as they might seem at first, because truth has never been a linear or one-dimensional value. But more on that in some other episode, both in the past and in the future. Put a pin on the corkboard. All truths are but half-truths, and the only absolute truth is that there is no absolute truth, because of the very relativistic nature of the physical material reality as we understand it now. You don't even need to go up beyond that level, but I am inviting you to, because if you merge all that is real and valid out of science, stripping it away out of any corruption and misleading and nonsensical stuff that is there because of foul play and bad influence, for nothing. No human endeavor is free of the ego's, interference with it, because that's what ego is, right? A spiritual phenomenological aspect of the human individual that is there to be like a little devil on the shoulder and lead us astray. Whilst also serving to help us survive, because no one thing is an absolute good or bad. No one being, people push towards the extremes, of course, to the point of being unrecognizable, tragically, on occasion. But in terms of the living phenomena, it's all a continuity of this oneness with the very mind that is bringing it into existence to begin with. And that is the cosmos itself. Not to be hyper-personified, but to be known or understood more as like an intradimensional, multidimensional, fractal holographic living incubation chamber of shape and form that is, of course, reflective of the shapes and forms we see around us, but also infinitely mind-bogglingly different, because it is operating at a scale infinitely mind-bogglingly larger than a literal animal, flesh-born, living womb here on this dimension, in this plane, as we know it. That was a lot to unload on you, dear audience member, but I digress. At the core of this is a suggestion. This is a theoretical suggestion. I'm asking you to consider it, follow along, test it, ask questions about it, and help me to refine it if you don't disagree. And if you do disagree, help me to find its critical flaw that completely debunks it. But toroidal, fractal, recursive, holographic mathematics, living mathematics, would be like the new science department. If the literary character known as the incorrigible Mr. Zeppo had lived a life where he had been an Einstein of his generation, right? Now imagine the book series. I could write about that, like a sort of, what was that really cute movie where Einstein is played by that guy from the Odd Couple TV show and one of the versions of the Odd Couple movies, the really tall one, the grouchy one, where he's Einstein. He's so adorable. It's one of my favoriteest movies of all time. He rides a motorcycle and goes, Yahoo! But imagine that, but instead of being Einstein, it's the incorrigible Mr. Zeppo in some sort of, near future, or just on the cusp of dystopia, disastrous, timeline. But he brings about the science entitled whatever I just said there, because I don't think I can repeat that exact phrasing all over again just now, because it just came out of my mouth just then for the first time, I think. And that this system, this study of a living mathematics, an alive mathematics of a mathematics of consciousness, if you can imagine it, which is sort of like a computing language, mathematical, theoretical structure, construct, model of a living cosmos which weaves matter into existence through sheer will of focused consciousness, and that is in part, although not completely, it's part of a huge, very complex algorithmic formula. One ingredient is literally belief. Now, for the purposes of fictionalizing and turning it into, whatever category, genre of fiction that my book series of the Zeppoverse would be categorized under, which I think broadly sci-fi would be the simplest one to chuck it into. This mathematics itself as a language, once decoded and deciphered by a team of acolytes. No, is that the right word? A team of enthusiasts and or students of, supporters of, there's a word I'm looking for that comes from like when the Greek and the way the Greek would teach each other. The Greek philosopher had his, perhaps acolytes is the right word, or whatever the right, insert correct word here, like a breakthrough discovered science that finally completely accurately describes as much of the phenomenological universe as we can possibly describe using conceptually created man-made languages that are reliant on still us sitting here in these talking meat sacks to talk to each other with the tongue and the mouth wagging and saying it in words and syllables and writing it down in symbols that we create, right? That beyond that, this the only thing that this mathematics cannot describe is that which is known to phenomenologically occur, but cannot be defined or described by any known human language, any potential knowable human language, because it resides beyond a barrier which can be measured and verified and phenomenologically witnessed, experienced, visited, as it were, as if it were terrain in a state park. You can go visit the liminal boundary of the universe, where quite literally all language, no matter how clever, whether devised already or some point in the future, just falls apart and cannot contain, describe, define, and in any shape or form, way possible, approach the description of. And yet it is knowable that there's phenomena there that must exist and are central to the ongoings of all the rest of it, no matter how mundane, up to and including me sitting here doing anything, whether it is narrating this to the tape recorder or just having sat here done nothing, right? That it's that real. And that complete of like a postmodern science. And that this language, this mathematical, theoretical construct, once fully articulated in a computational form and like sort of like in a trippy, tip of the hat, wink wink nudge nudge homage to such computers of science fiction past, it kind of sort of almost specifically, but not quite limited to, the ones in The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, Omnibus Edition, right? And don't like the movies, all the media versions that have existed so far are great, but do not suffice. The book is in and of itself its own beautiful experience, worth reading, cover to cover, in that fullest of omnibus editions, if you can track it down and get it for yourself. Full thumbs up, genuine endorsement. In fact, my character, the incorrigible Mr. Zeppo, keeps this book on hand as one of the top 50 books most important to preserve, science, inspirationally, spiritually, philosophically, scientifically speaking, should any sort of near apocalyptical event happen to occur. That's an existant list, which is a MacGuffin of sorts, sort of like an important, tangible collection of objects that must reside in the Zeppoverse as real things, because they reside in my universe as real things, and in my universe, because they reside as real things, I have genuinely come to certain real-life conclusions that are inherently part of the world building for my narrative fiction. The language that I was describing, right, invokes all of those books to some degree or another, in as much as certain ideas are critical in each of them. But what I was trying to say is, once it is embodied akin to like when they, built that first supercomputer to ask it the question, it becomes sort of like not just a working model of the universe, but a sentient, living, holographic, recursive, phenomenological being that is like as if you could create a universe in a computer and it was a real universe, and what it renders is a person that you can now interact with as a person, from the perspective of it knowing it is a universe itself, like a complete whole universe that would be very much like the known universe in the reality that you exist in, right? You could model it so accurately and let it sit resident in a computer so advanced that essentially that computer, the moment from turning it on, transcends from being an inanimate object, a very highly powerful, super duper computer, into like a living, organic meta being with some supernatural powers that now is forced to exist compressed in a fashion that makes it appear to you and all those that are alive in this universe as a person very similar to most average people, but also being eerily alien and foreign and resplendent in its own secrets and abilities that are, eventually to be discovered, because it is itself truly a living universe, right? Extrapolated from our own and accurately described from within, as from our own perspective as living people being, in the place we find ourselves, the thing we call the world, in its broadest understanding. And having achieved that, these characters then proceed to debate, the nature of reality. This person that is this universe, whilst being conscious and aware that it is itself a universe, does it the way people are people. Totally, fully, organically, naturally born, ignorant of the very miracle they are, incapable of comprehending what it is, the totality of their experience to which they even get, find themselves from within in terms of their own narrative, tediously bored of, is that a grand scale of a miracle that, it renders all life into existence within itself. Humanity lives unconscious of how its own organism functions, and that is the brute reality of what we are like. We've had to fight to create a model and a theoretical expression of what we think is going on, but truly, genuinely, deep down, we do not know. And so this character, once the computer, once it's fired up and it goes through its initiation thing and sort of like explodes into existence, transforming whatever the giant supercomputer apparatus may have looked like before, it sort of all disappears and contracts into a white hole, which then expands out into a roughly humanoid shape, which is also sort of mysteriously foreign and alien looking and sort of uncanny valley, unreal looking in some way that even I can't describe. their arguments render, the what is celebrated within his own lifetime, this Professor Zeppo version of the incorrigible Mr. Zeppo, for there are many different iterations, right? He is sort of like the first in his manifold expression across his own personal probability waveform function of multiple cells being expressed in multiple universes that are parallel and constantly branching away in divergence based on choice and context and rendered results within each particular path or life path or life tunnel, life probability waveform tube, which is the most accurate form I can describe it in the words that I'm using to communicate with you without co-opting words from a language you wouldn't understand. And this whole new sort of thesis has one sort of unanswerable question or issue, is that just like the human person can, sort of is born in ignorance and has a really hard time without the help of generations of other people and experts and scientists and all of that mishigas that we get to our living model of what we think we know about the world and our bodies and how they work, is ultimately was born ignorant. And if there was no body of work, however much debate about whether it's accurate or not may rage on, if there was no body of work available at all, we would be sitting here sharing life together in complete, utter, brutal ignorance of how the body works, beyond the obvious, beyond that which we could experience and report to one another in common knowledge, which is what most people mistakenly consider common sense. But common sense doesn't exist. Common sense is actually a peer pressure tactic to get people to agree to any logic, flawed or otherwise, that they believe in, but that's a whole nother discussion. This aha moment, this unlocks sort of like a horizon, right? Like this experiment, when it succeeds, freaks everyone out. Plenty of people deny that, or argue that it's fake, that the Zeppo University of Applied Living Holographic Mathematics is a scam, and that there must be a way to debunk it, and that it's, because based on lies. But it is, in theory, it's meant to be ultimately proven in that world that it was indeed sort of all based on measurable phenomena that can be approached and experienced within the internal and intradimensional landscape of parts of the human phenomena that have been hitherto suppressed, neglected, ignored, or otherwise mocked, ridiculed, and marginalized. Some of which include that which is considered insanity, right? Like, and or the hallucinations of the drug-addled, which, of course, it being a substance inspired or connectively activated thing, people are quick to dismiss. So is the universe, right? In terms of, like, we living in our universe must cope with that reality that to a certain degree we cannot and will never be able to fully confirm even the most profoundly accurate, mathematically or otherwise, description of the universe, because it will have this boundary point where language falls apart, and yet there seems to be phenomena there that we can sort of still point to and recognize and go, that's something going on. But the words, there's no words there. But there is a sort of sense of comprehension of it in the instances when such phenomena are experienced by those individuals that achieve the capacity and the inner luminosity of having, successfully worked through all of the inner exercises that are prerequisite. The way, you wouldn't be able to lift an X amount of weight until you worked your way up to that through working out your body and improving the physique, right? You don't go lift Olympic weights at an Olympic competition without risking serious injury and damage to the body if you didn't work out and train like an Olympic weightlifter, right? I wouldn't walk off the streets and try to compete about lifting anything there, especially none of the really hardcore stuff. Well, similarly, there's certain things that can only be approached certain ways through certain, avenues of the phenomenological web of experiences, cloud of experiences that are all nexuses in and around sort of phenomenologically, inherently, organically, truly, genuinely part of each human individual being. Whether any given being is capable of fully experiencing them all is not so much about their worthiness, but rather the capacity and the body's limitations, flaws, or arguably mutations with adverse effects that shutter out the perceptual sensitivity to some of this phenomena. But with a theory and a thesis and a model, there can be teachings taught, right? Practices taught. Practices being generally applicable term to satisfactorily describe, the kinds of mental, phenomenological, transcendental navigations through the maze that is the many aspects of the phenomena beyond and within the mind, which some would laugh at, just off the cuff, be like, none of that. Oh, that is nonsense. I didn't know what this thing. It's just you and your thoughts, and that's it. Okay. The universe being much more complex than the simplest level of cognitive processing allows us to perceive, we can surmise that there's plenty phenomenologically going on in the actual universe and cosmos that without special assistance from either instrumentation or transformational adjustments of our own apparatus, we are very unlikely to ever encounter, especially if we're not actively working to achieve such encounters. That rabbit hole, the organic one, literally the warren of phenomena you experience and or encounter that you could describe as like a journey down a rabbit hole towards the very center of your own mind. It's truly the only pursuit worthy of the human species' full attention, right? Collectively and individually. We have riddled the landscape of our potential awareness with everything and every possible combination of things else, most of which are not contributing towards any of it, right? Like they're just contributing towards being distracted in a way and turning away outwards, externally, or even inwards, but in all the wrong forms, towards an ego narrative assault on the senses or against the senses or against the perceived world out there. Thus, the political shenanigans that we experience instead of and yeah, I get it, utopia sounds stupid and most people use that word dismissively, but consider it the natural potential possible opposite of inverse opposite of what we got going on, of what we decry as true dystopia. I mean, some people are claiming we live in dystopian times now, that this isn't it isn't something to dread might happen in the future, but that it's already enveloped us in dystopic madness. Inversely, the utopic then must therefore potentially be out there to be experienced. And if the universe works as of sort of to mechanize it for analogy's sake, if it works like a collective and individual voting booth for what we might experience kind of machine of weaving reality based on what we vote for, not, as much with our words as with also our actions and with our beliefs and our inner presumptions, assumptions, and projections. Like, if someone chooses to make you a bad guy in their life, that you're going to be the bad guy no matter what you do, right? If someone chooses to idolize and worship you, you're going to be idolizable and worshipable almost ad nauseum forever, until something really totally forces them to question why they would idolize him. And vice versa, in every possible direction. Our minds create the reality as much as our minds perceive the reality. And belief is just one of a huge array of tools and mechanisms by which we engage in that phenomena of rendering it into existence, for us to then immediately experience it as if it were always permanently there in some sort of persistent way, which it is, but it isn't, because we alter it continually. Because we are the womb, right? We're giving birth to ourselves. We are the cocoon. We are the butterfly in mid-gestation, liquefied goo in the chrysalis, living as these ambulatory meat sacks that can walk and jump and speak and reproduce willingly or otherwise. And we've created an artificial world around us that is beyond or besides the point, that which we call our man-made world, our society, our societal world, our industrial world, our commercial world, our imagineered, shared socio-political economic construct is abusively self-toxic and riddled with traps, corruptions, and disturbances that do everything but encourage us to come to grips with reality as it actually is, and come to understand it as fully as we potentially can through organic phenomena that acknowledges the inner world as much as it acknowledges the outer world. Because they are, in a way, sort of like a hallway of mirrors, infinitely regressing, recursively reflecting back on itself. Which is sort of, the ultimate message, right? If the universe could suddenly miraculously provide us with a new miracle spokesperson that would blow so many people's minds that it would transformatively alter the collective consciousness of the entire species in a way that organically, peacefully, immune from all the critique, just transform ourselves and our society and each other into the most, golden and idyllic version possible, while still being really real, right? And really raw and really here. And perhaps achieving that which seems to be indicated as possible deep within the human mind to some degree or another, which is to transcend the very flesh into living, conscious, cognating, communicating, holographic light. Because for many reasons beyond the fact that is quite literally one of the teachings of Christ that most Christians curiously and unimaginably don't seem to ever recall. He quite literally speaks that, and you can still quite, clearly see it in the text, and that it must have been even more explicit in more ancient and authentic, closer to the original expressions of it in terms of language. This duality, non-duality bridge between the individuated mind and the metacognitive, cosmic, supra-universal mind is unimaginable or was unimaginable, but by creating art about it and making that art artfully, fractally, holographically recursive, we can invoke, I think, a deep and genuine inner phenomenological recalling or re-remembering of such intra-connected spiritual super awareness that is literally and figuratively transformative of both the mind and the spirit and the soul and the very heart and being of any given man or woman or whatever label you prefer, to the point where we would stop bickering about all of this because we would become something grander than we can describe now, in a sort of transcendent resplendence beyond the scope of our language, which is arguably what all the prophets pointed towards in their deepest, authenticest, most original, most genuine expression that we can dig up and find. Having said all that, and acknowledging that it can sound as crazy as the next crazy thing that isn't true, the catch-22 is that negative belief truly has been proven already in our mundane world to function as a filter. If you choose to disbelieve or to invest in the power of belief that something is not true, it becomes really hard to experience it. So, those who refuse to believe in magic are very unlikely to ever experience it or witness it or find it, because it won't be seen. But arguably, if all indicators point towards a true unlocking, then it would be as if, imagine, that supercomputer living universe person, if suddenly each and every single individual cell inside of their weird foreign alien body suddenly became a whole being that was aware of their position and their integral, meta existence within this living universe. And if you're now replace that character with your own being, imagine if deep within your entire multidimensional inner selves came to that realization that this is this is one of the junctures of the universe experiencing itself from a nodal point of attenuating a two-way lens. Who was it? I want to end on this point because I've just about trashed my voice sharing all this crazy rambling thought. I think it was not Osho, but Muji? Some guru guy with a funny name, no offense, who says something along the lines of the event witnessed, the lens of perception, and the mind that is experiencing it. It's one and the same. There's a trifecta of our experience, and we are that which is being experienced. We are the experiencer, and we are the body lens through which that experience is communicated. And it's a multi-directional phenomena. It isn't just the taking in of the senses. It's like a whole recursive, fractal, holographic, toroidal, electromagnetic whirlwind of creating our own individual universe and the collective metaverse and the many infinite universes of whatever kind of multiverse of, very genuine and real organic multiverse of multiverses, where each one of those ultimately is the genome, the building blocks of the cells, let me get this statement right. Each of that universe things build up to the very building blocks of the subatomic particles, of the atomic particles, of the chemistry and alchemy that is each and every genomic spiral in a because it is its own toroidal little twirling double helix spiral, right? It conforms to sacred geometric mathematics and completes the integration of the recursive loops of perpetuating cognition and sentient awareness through this cellular phenomena of being, embodiment, of being in flesh. The whole thing being a fractal, each layer of it is recursively, more complex, less complex, but a repetition of the whole of an image. Thus, we get lost in a hallway of mirrors and latch onto whatever our one nodal point feels at home, and we block out and filter out all the rest. But it's all there to be reconnected to and to be healed with and through. When some of us say we must heal ourselves in order to be able to heal each other, so that we can facilitate the species, transformationally healing the entire species. It's at that sort of interdimensional space that we point towards, and therein lies the challenge, right? Culturally, to reach a thorough enough understanding collectively in order to achieve a progressively expansive enough wave of aha moment, like embodiment of comprehension. Because once you embody a comprehension, it's no longer crazy foreign to you, right? Like, once your body comprehended all the physics involved in riding a bicycle was suddenly a breeze. But remember the terrifying, horrific nausea of the first few moments when trying to learn? Even if you got it really quick, there was this sheer terror of, like, the body going, this is a new experience. What is all this new sensory input? What does this all mean? And although you probably never understood it in physics, in the terms of the scientific, language of quantum mechanical physics, you also did inherently at a cellular level. And thus the whole thing echoes in on itself and creates a hallway of mirrors of, I don't know where to stop, except to say namaste. And thank you for tuning in for this strange and mysterious episode. And of course, humbly invite you to consider turning inwards and seeking beyond the silence of the echo chamber of your own mind to see that which is the place you call myself, or I am this, I am that, where it is beyond language and before language and underneath the various sort of ego-driven constructs of the mind for yourself, right? Instead of just imagining that it is possible, actually experiencing it directly. That's the cliffhanger challenge before I bid you a fond farewell and return to you in a future episode.